Well, welcome to our Annenberg Research Seminar for today. We're delighted to have Barbara Wilson with us today. She is the Kathryn Lee Baynes Dallenbach Professor of Communication at the University of Illinois, and is also the Vice Provost for Academic Affairs at the university. She did her PhD work at the University of Wisconsin, and for many years was on faculty right up the road at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where she was a mentor and advisor of our own Stacy Smith. So the ties and connections between Barbara and many of us here at USC are really quite close. We're really delighted to have you here today. She has published more than 60 articles and books on the effects of media on children. She was co-author of a very well-known 3-volume study on the National Television Violence Study that was published in the late 1990s, and was co-author of Children, Adolescents, and Media. Barbara is an elected fellow of the International Communication Association, and today she has written a Super Bowl-themed article, a presentation entitled "Move It, Football Head, Can Children Learn to Disrespect from Television?" We're delighted to have Barbara Wilson here for our talk.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I have to tell you the weather's a little better than it is in Illinois right now, so I really appreciate what you've ordered up, because I heard that it was rainy before and it might get rainy again, so I squeezed into some warm weather. I chose this title in part to be a little bit provocative. This is actually a line from a TV show called Hey Arnold, and it's only at the Annenberg School where I would get an email ahead of time from one of your students saying, "Wait a minute, I was the character in this TV show, and I remember this line, and I want to know what you're going to talk about." So I don't know if she's here today.
She is here, but she just stepped out.
Okay. I said, come to the talk. It's nothing to be frightened of. Anyway, what I'd like to do today is talk about a series of projects that we're working on right now that are really kind of in the preliminary stages. So I'm really eager for feedback. I'd love you to give me some ideas of what your thoughts are about these, about some of the ideas that I'm going to propose. And some of the data I'll present are a little preliminary because we're still working on the coding for one of the studies. But and also, I don't mind if you stop me in the middle and ask a question. I have no problem with that. So please, if something really strikes you or you don't understand what I'm saying, raise your hand. I'm going to start this, set the stage by sharing with you some things off some parenting websites. I spend time on parenting websites, not because I'm a lawyer or that I have some prurient interest, but you can find out a lot about what parents are worried about, concerned about, if you can go to parenting websites. And these are a couple of remarks that I just pulled off in the last couple of days, so you can find these all over the place, and I'll share them with you. I have an 11-year-old son who talks back and likes to make smart remarks about me. I just make him go sit in his room until he can be nice to everyone, and sometimes I take his TV privileges away. A lot has to do with what kids watch on TV and who their friends are. Another one, my 6-year-old has suddenly become sassy and disrespectful in her manner at home. She told me to buzz off when I asked her to take out the trash, and she calls me names when she gets angry. 6-year-old. Now that I have children, I have learned that TV is the enemy. TV shows for children teach them that sassy children are very funny. The laugh track can't be wrong, can it? And last but not least, children imitate what they see and hear, and I notice an epidemic of sassiness today. Kids are rude and loud, just like the ones on Rugrats. As it turns out, these little excerpts from parent websites are consistent with the way that large numbers of parents feel today. And I just pulled some polling data here for you. There was a study very recently by the Kaiser Family Foundation. 2/3 of parents say they are very concerned that children in this country are being exposed to too much inappropriate content in the media. A lot of that concern is violence and sex. But as it turns out, in some of the focus groups they did, they also found that a lot of parents were worried about, concerned about TV depictions in which parents seem dumb and kids are encouraged to be sassy. And then a slightly older poll, but I think a provocative one done by children now in the late 90s. 65% of American children, 10 to 16, believe that shows like The Simpsons encourage kids to disrespect their parents. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these issues, as you can imagine from the title, but let me give you a little background. I'm guessing a lot of you know these data, but they're hot off the press. The Kaiser Family Foundation has been doing an annual, not annual, but every so often, every few years, a national survey of how much time kids in this country are spending with the media. And they just released their most recent findings in 2009. Well, actually, I think they released them in 2010, but the data are based on a 2009 survey. 8 to 18-year-olds, national study. Kids today in this age range are spending an average of 7 hours and 38 minutes a day with media. Okay, and interestingly, that's up from 5 years ago when it was 6 hours and 21 minutes. So the amount of time seems to be on an increase. Okay, and if you think about it, I don't know how much time you spend with kids, but they have to sleep. Okay, so if you figure they're sleeping a minimum of 8 hours a day, they're supposed to sleep more than that, but they often don't. But 8 hours a day, and then the amount of time they're in school, you realize that most of the extra time in kids' lives is with some form of media. Okay, now interestingly, television viewing still dominates the time that kids spend with television, and this is counter to what a lot of people believe because of all the new technologies out there. But kids are often accessing television through their handheld devices and on the computer. So it's still the case that a lot of kids are spending the majority of their time with television. Okay? And this is a great picture. You can imagine, you've probably seen kids like this. 71% of kids in this study, 8 to 18-year-olds national sample, have a TV in their bedroom. And this, of course, girl has a lot more equipment than that. Okay? Now, what about younger kids? We also know from national studies how much infants to 6-year-olds, so I'm trying to fill in the gaps below the 18 to 18-year-olds, or 8 to 18-year-olds. And this was a national study done in 2003. In this age range, kids are spending an average of 2 hours a day with media. Remember, these are average statistics, so a lot of kids are spending more time. Obviously, the time goes up during this range from infant to 6 years, so the older kids are spending more than 2 hours. And 36, over a third of this sample, national sample, have a TV in their bedroom. Okay. Now, I signal the TV in the bedroom because all of the research suggests that when you have a TV in your bedroom, it enhances the amount of time you spend with the media, and it also predicts a lot of other things that aren't so good. So I throw that up just to give you a sense of what's going on. Both my daughters are dying for a TV in their bedroom, and I say to them, your mother studies media and children. You know, it's a bummer for you, but you're never going to have a TV. You can't get talked about it, and then admit that I succumb to your question. All right. So the question is, do children learn from the media? This is a cute little comic that kind of plays off on this idea. The mother's on the phone doing some poll with somebody, and she says, I don't place much credence in the effects of TV violence on children. And you can see in the background her very young boy is imitating the TV show that he is watching. He's got a rope, the bad guy's got something else about to strangle somebody. There are a lot of data and a lot of studies out there that have looked at children's learning from the media. This is a graph I pulled together for a piece I did for the Future of Children a year ago. And I pulled out all the meta-analyses that exist. I'm hoping most of you know what meta-analyses are, statistical summaries of all the research in these areas. And you can see that these are the effect sizes for relationships that have been pretty well studied in the social science arena. The one that you're probably most familiar with is the link between TV violence and children's aggressive behaviors. This was a meta-analysis done in the mid-90s by Paik and Comstock, and the effect size is about 0.31, which is a moderate-sized effect for those of you who are statistical gurus. Here's the effect size for video game violence and aggression, and again, there are far fewer studies here, but this is so it's a slightly smaller effect size. Some people argue that the effects are bigger. Other people argue we don't know anything, like Dimitri. But in general, well, we don't have the right research yet. But in general, if you aggregate these studies, you'll see that the effect size here is smaller than it is for television. But I think we don't really have all the data we need on this one. But look across here. We've got TV and fear of victimization, pro-social TV, and so here's sort of the anti-social effects, but lo and behold, we also have good data on positive effects. Pro-social TV exposure to and pro-social behavior, altruism, social skills, and acceptance of others. So we've got a lot of data out there and a lot of studies that show pretty convincingly that there's a link between heavy exposure of certain types of TV content and children's behavior. And these studies are experiments, longitudinal studies, surveys, etc. So the question is, what about disrespect and sassiness? You can tell where I'm leading here. I use a couple of theoretical perspectives in most of my research, and I'm just going to mention them very quickly. Social cognitive theory, which is the ramped up version of social learning theory by Albert Bandura. The reason that I point this out is that not so much because it's a fancy theory. We all know that children imitate. They often imitate the very things you don't want them to imitate. But as it turns out, we also know that children will imitate more under some circumstances than others. And the beauty of this theory is it points to what I call contextual features that we should pay attention to, like is the behavior rewarded or punished? Is the role model an attractive character? And are the models similar to children themselves? The more similar the model is, the more likely a child is to imitate. There's also a lot of work being done in information processing, which takes a lot of the tenets of social cognitive theory and says, what about long-term learning? What happens when children get exposed repeatedly to different kinds of content in the media? Then how do they learn over the long term? Social cognitive theory doesn't help us so much with that theory, but information processing does. And here's just a quick little model that Huseman and others have worked on over the years that shows you that what happens a lot of times in children's lives is they encounter a social problem in the school, in their home. They evaluate the environmental cues. They try to figure out how to respond. They search, not always consciously, for a script in their memory, how to respond to a situation. And if they've been exposed to a lot of media, those scripts often are very guided by the media. If they feel like it's an appropriate script, after evaluating it, they behave according to the script. Okay? The more you're exposed to the media, the more your scripts are going to look like media content. Okay? And so over time, what can happen is that you have very well-developed scripts that get triggered pretty easily in a lot of different kinds of situations. Okay? All right. I want to acknowledge that I've got lots of grad students working with me. In fact, now that I'm in the provost's office, I rely very heavily on these folks to keep my research going, because my meetings have now just taken up my entire calendar, as those of you who do administration know. Kristen Drogos, Brad Bond, and Veronica Hefner have been working on some of this research. So now I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about two studies that deal with this whole idea of disrespect or sassiness in the media. First study is a content analysis. One of the first things we wanted to know is, all right, well, parents think there's a lot of this stuff on television. Is there? Do we really know if this kind of material is rampant, or are people just pointing to isolated examples or certain kinds of programs, and those are the ones that are most, where these behaviors are most prevalent? So we did a content analysis. We asked the obvious question, how much disrespect is featured on television? And notice I'm not using the term sassy now, because we've enlarged the concept to disrespectful behavior. Secondly, we really wanted to know how is it portrayed, because social learning, social cognitive theory would tell us it's not so much it's there, but how is it portrayed? Who are the characters that are engaging in this kind of behavior? How are other characters responding to it? Is there a rewards associated with being disrespectful? You can imagine, if you can think of examples, that maybe that's the case. Is it ever punished on television? Does anyone get in trouble for being disrespectful or sassy? And how is humor used in these kinds of contexts? We know that humor can trivialize aggression. Does it do similar kinds of things in the context of disrespect? So we wanted to look at how these behaviors are portrayed, not just how often they occur. And in this particular study, we were very interested in the programs that children watch. So it's a smaller sample than some of the larger content analyses that we've done, but we were really interested in, okay, let's figure out where kids' eyeballs are and code what's going on in those shows. So it turns out it's really challenging to come up with definitions of these kinds of behaviors. And I guess people felt that way about violence in the media, too, at one point. I know that we struggled over a lot of our definitions for NTVS. Stacy, you can probably remember that. But it's really hard to define sassy, disrespectful behavior. At least we found it so. And many of my students I was working with often said, you know what, I know it when I see it. You know, well, that's not good enough for a content analysis. We have to actually come up with a definition. So after lots of weeks of really struggling and watching lots of clips, we came up with a definition that we think works pretty well. Verbal or nonverbal display in which a character shows a lack of regard for another. Okay, now that's a little bit vague, but what we mean by lack of regard is that the display somehow devalues or discredits the other person, the other character. And we also stipulated that the target had to be present in the situation in order for us to code it. You might wonder why we did. Well, we didn't want to get into scenes where people were talking about someone who wasn't even in the room, or reiterating some behavior or complaining about somebody. We really wanted to focus particularly on those kinds of behaviors where the source or the perpetrator, I'll use that term here, actually does this in the same context as the target. Okay, because we're thinking about imitation, frankly, and we're also thinking about the notion that it's probably a little more harmful if the target's in the room than if you're talking about someone who's not there, although we can debate that, and we could have opened our definition up, but we decided not to. We were interested in coding every single incident of disrespect, but we recognized very quickly that a behavior or disrespectful incident could be verbal, but it also could be behavioral. And so, or it could have both. So we opened the coding scheme up to allow for various types of verbal disrespect, as well as different types of nonverbal displays that were that fit the definition of disrespect. I'll just spend a minute on the verbal disrespect, because as it turns out, I'm heading to my findings, but I'll mention it now because it'll help you. Most of the disrespect is verbal, okay? So most of what we found is verbal. And so what we disengaged or differentiated different types of behaviors, because as it turns out, there's a whole range of these kinds of things on television. And I don't think I have time to show clips. I did bring some clips, but I'm not sure I'll have time. And they range from what I would call discourteous talk, which means you're just not being very polite, but you may not necessarily intend to hurt someone, all the way to mean talk, which is the kind of behavior where you really want to hurt somebody, okay? And intent to harm really differentiates those two categories. Coders have to look within the plot to figure out whether or not there's an intent to harm or not. And we also wanted to code sassy talk, because if any of you are around kids, you know that a lot of times, my daughters are terrible at this, you know, they'll say something to me and I can't tell you how many times in a day I say, honey, that sounded a little sassy. Do you want to say that again? I'm your mom, I'm not your friend, you know. And so we wanted to get at sassy talk as well. So these are the different categories of verbal, and then the nonverbal are pretty, or the behavioral are pretty obvious. As I mentioned, we wanted to code the context. So we looked at the nature of the perpetrator and the target. We coded simple things like demographics. We also wanted to see, was the character a good or a bad character within the plot? How physically attractive is the character? Turns out most characters on television are above average attractiveness. But we really wanted to differentiate those that are made to look even more attractive and then those that are made to look unattractive, okay? And we looked at the type of relationship between the perpetrator and the target. Again, trying to figure out what kind of incidents are kids getting repeatedly exposed to in terms of script building.
Can I ask you a quick question
Yes.
about the type of relationship? So, did you look at whether it's upward, like a parent or authority,
Yes.
versus whether it's a peer?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So we have parent-child, teacher-child,
Yeah.
peer-peer,
Police
friends,
child, yeah,
siblings.
yeah.
As it turns out, a lot of the behavior that we found in this particular sample, which is a pretty good sample, is peer-to-peer, okay? But there is a fair amount of parent-to-child and parent-to-teacher. So those three categories capture most of the behaviors. Okay, other things we coded, rewards, I already mentioned. So does the character feel good about him or herself after doing this? A lot of times they'll say something, then they'll smile at themselves for how clever they are. Do other characters praise them? Okay, good job, that's a riot, you know, that kind of thing. And then is there ever material reward for these kinds of things, okay? And then we also looked at punishment. How often does the perpetrator feel badly after saying something like this or doing something like this? And how often do others in the context condemn the character? We, of course, coded humor, wanted to know how often these things are laughed at, whether there's a laugh track or not, that kind of thing. All right, the sample in this study, we used Nielsen ratings, and we wanted to look at most popular shows for kids between 6 and 11, okay? So it's a kind of a really crucial age, mostly elementary school. These kids are pretty high in terms of imitation, as many of you know. And we looked at 4 different sources of programs. We picked the most popular programs across those 4 time slots to get a variation in terms of channels and in terms of time periods. We ended up with 48 programs, and we videotaped 2 episodes of each. So we have almost 100 programs in the sample, all the things the kids are really watching between this age range. Okay? It's not as big of a sample as NTVS, but I think it's a pretty good sized sample, especially because it's really targeted to what kids are watching. Here's some examples of some of the shows in our sample. You probably know some of these shows. They range from things like Drake and Josh, which I would call tween sitcoms. We have a lot of those in the sample. We have some cartoons or animated programs. And we even have, believe it or not, Dancing with the Stars, okay, and Nanny 911. So we have some reality shows in the sample as well. So there's a lot of different kinds of shows that make up this sample. They aren't all cartoons. They aren't all tween shows. All right, what did we find? Well, maybe this surprises you, maybe it doesn't. 95% of the programs contain incidents of disrespect. So the idea of finding safe zones in our sample just isn't there, okay?
That's unbelievable.
Yeah, 95%. There were 2 shows in our sample, and by the way, we're about 80% done coding, so you're going to have to just don't write any of these findings down because they could adjust by a little bit over time, but we're about 85% done with the coding right now. The one show that didn't have any was Blue's Clues, so I'm just trying to give you an idea of where the safe zones are, okay? But the vast majority had some instance of verbal disrespect, but the interesting thing is really looking at the rate of this. Across this sample of programs, 19 incidents per hour. Different examples of these kinds of behaviors, okay?
Can I ask a question about the 19? So if I disrespected you and you disrespected me back, is that 2?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So anytime the target, that's a good point, anytime the target or the source changes, it's a new incident. Yeah.
You do have some examples of each, right?
I do have some, so I hope we have time. Yes, absolutely.
Barb, real quick, what did the type of incident change?
Yes, that would also. So if you did a mean talk and then you stopped and then did a discourteous, that would also, okay? This is very similar to what we did for NTVS, by the way, which I threw up here just so you can get an idea. In these large studies of media violence, what we find on average is 6 incidents of physical aggression per hour. So if you would argue that we're kind of coding the similar kinds of things, incidents of one type of behavior versus the other, we're seeing a lot more of the disrespect, this is a bigger sample, than we are of violence. Yes,
In the 19, did you look
Did I
at
do something?
average number by the same perpetrator?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Did you look at the average number by the same perpetrator?
No, we didn't. We didn't because we aren't coding by character, we're coding by incident here. So are you asking whether it's the same people doing this all the time?
Well, yeah, you could be a character, and that's that character's
Yeah.
signature, so they do
Right,
a lot of it.
right.
So you could do how much of the thing is accounted for
Yeah,
by the same
and we could go
character.
back and look at that. My sense from looking at the data is that's not the case, especially in some of these tween shows. I don't know how many of you have watched things like Drake and Josh, or That's So Raven is in our sample. These kids are just doing this back and forth. It's pretty much the way that they interact with each other. And it's not just the sassy character or the disrespectful character. It is, but we can go back and look at that, and that's a really good point. Okay, any other questions about these? Okay, so let's look at a few other ways to examine the data. One thing we did is we separated these shows out in terms of target audience, because you remember we've got some Dancing with Stars and things like that, and we've got cartoons, and we also have these tween sitcoms. And what I think is really fascinating is if you look at the rate of disrespectful incidents, they vary by target audience. So remember, the average is 19 across all these shows, but look at where the rates are much higher, in fact, double. They're much higher in shows targeted to children and targeted to teens, okay, or tweens, all right, than they are in these reality shows, which is mostly what's in this category. So we're seeing a lot more of this in the shows that are actually targeted to young audiences. All right, we also, I think I'll skip over this. I already mentioned this, that most of these are verbal, okay, as opposed to behavioral. The vast majority are things that people are saying back and forth to each other.
Do you sort out by context the difference between respectful sass and disrespectful sass? Because I could imagine verbal play where back and forth goes at it and it's fun or it's show,
Yeah.
versus verbal play, and one could even be polite and disrespectful.
Yeah.
I hear tell.
It would, if it is really playful and it's not showing the lack of regard, it wouldn't even get coded. So remember our definition of disrespect. So as it turns out, I think most of it is not that way. But if it was purely two kids having fun, teasing, for example, with no intent to disregard or devalue the other person, like you can imagine some of you tease your partners and things like that, and you're not doing it in a disrespectful way, we wouldn't even code it. So. Okay. Types of verbal disrespect. As it turns out, the vast majority of the verbal comments are either discourteous, impolite, or mean talk. Okay. We didn't see as much sassy talk as we thought we would. Okay. We saw a lot of sassy intonation, but it didn't qualify as sassy talk the way we defined it. And we didn't see much defiance either. So the majority of what we saw were impolite kinds of comments or just downright mean kinds of comments. Okay? Now, what about the perpetrator? Who are these characters that are engaged in these kinds of behaviors? Now, remember that we are coding incidents and not characters. So we don't actually know how many male and female characters are in these shows. We could go back and look at that, but that's a lot more coding than what we're really interested in doing. So you have to take some of this, like the sex issue, you have to take into account the fact that there are more males than females in these shows, okay? We found 60% of the perpetrators are male. The reason we're missing 1% is they couldn't determine the gender on one of the animated characters. Not just that I don't know, but Adam, okay? So I wonder what the heck happened. But I was asking Stacy last night, what I think is really interesting here is to compare this to the NTVS, who's aggressive, who's violent. And because there again in that study, we didn't code every character, we just coded the perpetrators. And what was it, Stacy? It was over 70%. 71, thanks. 71% of perpetrators of physical aggression are male. And so what you see here is, I don't want to say more gender balance, but you see more females engaging in this kind of behavior than in physical aggression. Okay? It's still not even, but partly that reflects the fact that there are more male characters in these shows than female characters. What about the nature of the characters? In general, there's a lot of good characters engaged in disrespectful behavior, and these are the characters that kids typically pick for role models. Good, bad means they have a combination of motives within the program, but if you add good, bad with good, you're getting 57% of these characters have some good qualities to them, and they're engaging in disrespectful behavior. The physical appearance is kind of interesting. Again, most of them are quoted as average the way that we defined it, but 20% of them are highly attractive. They're made to look super attractive, and 20% are unattractive. If you just look at the percent that are average to pretty good looking, the majority of the characters who are perpetrating these kinds of incidences are attractive or somewhat attractive.
How do you determine attractiveness, let's say, on a Teletubby? I mean, what's it mean?
That wasn't in our sample, but that showed.
Maybe the sexual ambiguous.
No, most of those would be average for, a lot of the characters are average, but even in animated, unless you're doing something to, I hate to say it, hypersexualize a character, that would end up in this category, or doing something above and beyond to make them attractive. So the majority of animated characters are probably going to fall in the average category. The Teletubbies isn't in the sample, so I didn't have to worry about that particularly. All right, what about the age of the perpetrator of disrespect? As it turns out, what we found when we coded age is that 51% of the perpetrators are teen in age. Okay? Very few children in these shows are engaging in the disrespect. A few more adults, but this is the real eye-opener here. And again, this is across all these programs, not just between sitcoms. But this age group is the kind of group that a lot of kids are going to aspire to. Many of you have kids, you know who their fans are. I mean, it's Hannah Montana, it's all these characters, and 51% of the perps in this study were teens. Okay? What about rewards and punishments? 83% of the incidents involve neither punishment nor reward. Now, if you know the literature and the research that Bandura's done and others since him, it's not necessarily so much that you have to reward it. Kids will imitate it so long as it's not punished, okay? And so what we have is a lot of these incidents going on with neither rewards nor punishments. Very seldom are they punished overtly, 9% of the incidents. And then almost a 1 out of 4 involve humor, okay? Almost 1 out of 4 involve humor. And that could be either other people laughing, a laugh track, whatever the case is. Peter?
I know that you and the coders think these are disrespectful behaviors. Do you know whether the kids themselves, because if I remember back to when our kids were that age, they engaged in a lot of that kind of behavior, but they didn't necessarily themselves see it as disrespectful.
I think that's a really good comment. And my short answer is no, we don't, because this is just to try to see what's out there. I think the next step is to show kids some of these incidents and see how they interpret them. Does it matter whether they recognize them as disrespectful? Are we making something up? I would say no, because the literature on social aggression is quite clear that these kinds of behaviors are very hurtful to kids. And in fact, if you look at the research on social aggression, one of my doctoral students, former doctoral students, did a lot of work on social aggression in the media. And some of this is social aggression, some of it isn't. Kids, the targets of these behaviors, frequently feel very upset by them. Even though they're done in a humorous context and there's bantering back and forth, the person who's the butt of it is pretty often not feeling very good about it. And so I think the interesting thing is that a lot of kids have become desensitized to this kind of behavior. And what would be really interesting and what our next step will be is to get out and actually show kids some of these clips and figure out how they interpret them. And whether the laugh track matters, for example, because my guess is that if you have humor and you have a whole crowd get kicking up about these things, kids are going to interpret it differently than if someone's got a pained expression on their face after someone makes fun of them or says something nasty to them. So I think that's a really good question. Okay, let's keep going. The last couple of slides I want to show you are examples of why I think the age of the perpetrator really makes a difference. Here we're actually looking at the age of the perpetrator and how often something is sassy. In the next slide I'll show you how often something's humorous. And what we find is that, and this combines children with teens versus adult perpetrators, what you find is that the sassy tone and the sassy talk is much more likely to occur with a youthful perpetrator than an adult. So when adults engage in this behavior, there's less likely to have sassiness associated with it, okay? And less likely to have humor associated with it. Okay, so it's definitely the case that when a younger person perpetrates this kind of behavior in the media, or at least on television, it looks different than when an adult does. Yes?
I'm curious, how do you define sassiness?
That was not easy, but what we're really coding here is sassy tone, okay? And so when you're watching these shows, you get a sense of what the character sounds like normally, and when they flip into sassiness, you can hear it. It's mostly a nonverbal kind of thing in the intonation. But we went around, we have a definition of it. I still think it's, you know, when you see it, frankly, the reliabilities are very high on here. I don't think our definition of sassiness is very sophisticated, if you will. But a lot of this is sassy tone, mapped onto other kinds of remarks.
So it's sort of imitative or sarcastic?
There's a level of sarcasm in it. It's got the... Maybe when I show you some clips, you'll see it. I could pull out the code book, but frankly, you know what, you would know it when you see it on the sassiness. And if you're a parent, you really know it.
You know it when it's directed at you.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to study 2 real quickly. briefly, because I want to open it up for Q&A. But the second study I want to present to you suggests that maybe some of this matters, okay? But it's just suggestive, and it's not the kind of study that I think we need to do, which is actually get out there and show kids some of these kinds of materials, get their interpretations, and try to figure out how kids are making sense of some of these materials. This was a study that we started, I guess, about a year ago, and it really wasn't motivated at all by sassy talk or disrespect. It was motivated because I wanted to know, what are younger kids doing with all these popular characters that are out there? They're spending a lot of time. Who are these characters that kids are liking? Why do they like them? Why are parents spending so much money on paraphernalia associated with these kinds of characters? And as it turns out, we have really good research on what elementary school kids think about favorite characters. We have some on what teens think, and we even have some on what young adults think about favorite characters, who they like, who they don't, who they wish they could be like, but we don't have anything on really young children. And that really is the age where there's all these products that you can buy for young kids. So there was a commercial motivation behind this study originally. But what we know from all of this research on older people is that kids and adults will show a strong same-sex preference. So girls are more likely to like girl characters, boys are more likely to like boy characters, but there's no real study of preschoolers. So we thought, well, what the heck, let's get out there and find out what this younger age group is interested in, particularly because it is so enmeshed with commercialization at this age. Now it is with older kids too, I'm not trying to argue it's more so, but I think, you know, you can only, I don't think older, I shouldn't say that because there are Hannah Montana pajamas. I was just about to say get pajamas with preschool characters, but that's not true. Anyway, so we wanted to look at who are these preschooler favorite characters, what are their reasons for attraction, and what kind of emotional connection do they have to these kinds of characters. We know from gender schema theory that children recognize their sex by about age 2, okay? They know whether they're a boy or a girl, but as it turns out, knowing that and then understanding that it doesn't change and having it really become part of their identity emerges over time. So we weren't quite sure what we were going to see with preschoolers. If any of you have been around preschoolers, you know that when they're really young, they often invite both boys and girls to birthday parties, and then they hit a certain age and it stops and it's only boys or only girls. So gender schemas develop over time. They're not as strong when you're in preschool. As you get older, all of a sudden, boys are icky or girls are icky, and then somehow or another you come back, sort of, or something. So anyway, so we expected some same-sex preferences in preschoolers, but we weren't quite sure. And again, a lot of the characters are not even clear what their sex is. So I think that the Teletubbies you know, but you can think of some others where you might not know. We hypothesized a lot of different things. Preschool boys we thought would select same-sex characters as favorites more than girls. And we didn't mean this to say girls are less gender schema. Why do you think we predicted this? Exactly. Because the reality is, if you're a girl, you just don't have as many characters that you can feel positively with who are same-sex. There are just fewer of them on television. We figured preschool boys, if gender schema was true and if it started at an early age, we predicted that preschool boys would report physical capability more often as a reason for liking their favorite character, but girls would report physical appearance more often, okay? Gender schema working at a young age. And we wanted to also look at a process called wishful identification. It's a construct in media research that has been developed over the years, the psychological desire to be like your favorite character. I don't think this is true just of children. If you think about Jennifer Aniston, then we don't have to say anything more, probably. But it's a psychological process, and we know that young kids feel very strong identification with some of their favorite characters. We wonder, does this happen in preschool? We know that preschoolers emulate superheroes during play. We also know that wishful identification turns out to be a really important moderator of a lot of media effects. It's true of media violence, it's true of pro-social, etc. So we thought, well, let's look at wishful identification too. And what we figured is that children would exhibit stronger wishful identification with same-sex characters than with opposite characters. We figured this would be even true in preschool. We figured for preschool girls, wishful identification will be related again to physical appearance, and for boys, it'll be related to strength, physical strength. So similar kinds of predictions for wishful identification. And then last but not least, we figured those kids who are watching more screen media will have stronger wishful identification than those kids who are spending less time with screen media. All right, 104 preschoolers. Man, it's hard to test 3 to 5-year-olds. The young sample, and it takes a long time to get through these interviews with young, because they get distracted and they want to talk about a lot of other things. But anyway, it's a fairly diverse sample. I wouldn't argue it's horribly diverse, but a little more diverse than what we often see in the literature. And we asked kids, who's your favorite character? Do you have a favorite character? Who is it? Why do you like, so we had it open-ended, why do you like that character? What kinds of things make you like the character? And then we actually had them rate their favorite character on a number of traits. Okay, funny, strong, helpful, nice, sassy, there you go, and good looking. Okay, and the kids saw a board with different levels of ratings, with different pictures so that they could figure out the ratings. And we defined sassy for them because we were a little nervous that, and by the way, this study was done before we started content analyzing Sassy TV, but I just wanted to know, like, is this something that resonates with kids? And so we defined sassy and we asked them to rate how sassy their characters were. Okay? We also asked how some items on wishful identification. How often do you dress up like your favorite character? How often do you pretend to be your favorite character? How often do you talk to your favorite character? Okay? All right, what did we find? Well, we found a few things that are probably pretty obvious to you, but they're important for gender schema theory. Boys selected same-sex characters significantly more often than girls did. Again, I don't think that's gender schema. I think that's the reality of what's available on television, okay? But boys cited the physical capabilities of the character as the reason for their choice more often than girls did. This is in their open-ended reasons for why they like their character. And girls went right to physical appearance more often than boys did. She's pretty, you know, I like her dresses, I like the way she looks, okay? And we also found that screen media related to wishful identification, which is one of our hypotheses. You can see, interestingly, TV viewing predicted wishful identification, but TV in the bedroom did not. Okay, and neither did computer use, because a lot of these characters are now involved in video games and other ways you can go to websites for these characters, but computer use did not predict wishful identification for the preschoolers. But here's the really interesting one. It takes me a long time to get back to the sassy thing, but I think this is really interesting. This is the difference between preschool girls and preschool boys. What predicts higher wishful identification with the character? Look at what we found as significant for girls. Attractiveness was marginally significant. We predicted that. Sassiness was a positive predictor of wishful identification. So the more sassy they thought their favorite character was, the more they wanted to be like that character. Okay? And strong, which was, we did not expect this. So thank goodness the girls are focusing on physical strength, or we think it's physical. I don't know exactly what strong means to them. And then look over here in the boys. How often your character gets in trouble is a positive predictor of wishful identification for the boys. Okay? What did you say, Stace? This is the anti-hero. This is Bart Simpson. How strong, which we predicted, and this is the good news, how helpful for little boys. So they kind of have, there's a little bit of paradox going on in here, but nevertheless, these are the factors that predict it. So for me, this is really interesting, and by the way, we found this also on a measure of parasocial interaction for kids too, that for girls, sassiness predicted their desire to play with and be friends with their character, but for boys it didn't. Okay? So I think there's something going on here, okay? I'm not willing to stand up and say that, this would happen with older kids. Remember, these are 3 to 5-year-olds, okay? But, and the other thing we're starting to look at in the content analysis is gender differences, sex differences in terms of perpetration, and whether or not our sense is, and that I didn't want to put the data up here because I think it's a little preliminary since it was marginally significant, but girls are doing this more than boys, the disrespectful behavior, which is consistent with all the literature on social aggression, by the way. That if girls are feeling frustrated and want to lash out, they do it socially, and boys tend to do it physically. So we're starting to see that in the sample, but I'm just not sure it's going to hold up when we finish all the coding. But it'll be really interesting to see what's going on between girls versus boys, and the disrespect. I'm guessing that it's going to be, we'll see more of the incidents with girl perpetrators and girl targets. So, all right, let me just Q&A. Couple of things, disrespectful talk, very frequent in the shows that children like, especially mean and discourteous talk. Twice as many incidents in these shows that are targeted to youth. So remember when we put the adult shows versus the young youthful shows, or the shows targeted younger, we saw a lot more of these kinds of incidents. If you think about social cognitive theory, the context of a lot of these incidents promotes learning. They're rarely punished. 1 in 4 are accompanied by humor. The perp is more often a young character than an older character. And the younger you are, the more likely you are to get laughed at and to have and include sassy tone in the interaction. And then the second study shows us that young children have strong emotional reactions to these characters, and as it turns out, in particular for girls, sassiness seems to be a part of what makes them want to be like their favorite characters. Okay, not so much for boys, but troublemaking does for boys. That may be the social versus physical aggression right there that you're seeing. And I guess I'll just conclude by asking ourselves, you know, we have a lot of role models out there for young children and teens in the media, and the question is, are these healthy role models? Are they pro-social role models? To be determined. Stay tuned for more research. So thank you very much. I'd love to open it up for questions.
I know this has not been part of your research, but in other media that children are exposed to, meaning that comic books, the possibility also of reading, if still some people read, whether any of these issues would you want to compare in terms of influence. And I realize that's not your purview here, but you know, I'm wondering about the sassiness and troublemaking behavior of literature and teen literature going back to Mark Twain, whether this isn't something that's always been there. In fact, even disrespect or authority encouraged in a way for certain times in society.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, one thing you could do is go back in time and compare older TV shows to newer ones. And I think that would be a really interesting way to see if these kinds of things have shifted over time within the medium of television. It doesn't quite get at the issue that you raised, but I think my guess is, and I don't have any data to support this, my guess is that it has changed over time on television. If I think about the shows that, I'm dating myself, that I watched when I was a kid, the Brady Bunch kids were not really very sassy or disrespectful with one another. I mean, occasionally they were, but it was not the way they interacted. If you see some of these shows today, it is just banter constantly back and forth. So my sense is that it's changed over time within television, but you raised the issue about what other media. And the one thing I would say, I mean, even if you compare it to books, the sassy tone you can't get from the books so well, unless you're imputing it onto the dialogue or the conversation. But I do think it would be interesting to look at other media. I'm thinking even, you know, it'd be interesting to see if we couldn't look at some of this in terms of social networking sites on computers and things like that. And I don't even know how to translate that yet, but it occurs to, I know there's a lot of dissing going on in Facebook and other places, and how would you capture that, for example, with youth? I think that would be a really interesting question, but that doesn't really get at, has it changed over time across media? And I think that's a great question. I'm not sure how to solve that one, but I certainly think you could do it with television over time. You could get old archives and look at whether things have changed pretty easily.
Did you look by rating at the sassiness? Because I'm wondering if a lot of sassiness occurs in TVY or TVY7
no, we
versus
haven't.
TVG.
We can easily go back and do that. Yeah, that's a good question. Dimitri?
It's a related comment. I was actually going to suggest that, but for a slightly different reason. In a content analysis I did with other Illinois PhD students in a different medium,
Right.
we looked at the outcomes. We looked at our results weighted and unweighted, and then weighted by popularity. In our case, it was sales data. If you were to then weight all of your outcomes by viewership, first of all, it gives you more of that kind of punch of generalizability, which is impact on eyeballs that you're going for. But the other thing we didn't think about, but which we wound up talking about later on, was the difference between the media as created and the difference in media as consumed. And so if you have enough variance in those top 48 shows, really
Yeah.
popular or less popular, you could then
I think we
see
do.
if the shows that were the most popular had more or less sassiness, and that also kind of gives you a little bit of speculation to say whether
Yeah.
it might be a cause of the popularity. Maybe you find out that the sassiness helps the ratings or hurts the
Yeah.
ratings, and this tells
That's
you a little
really
about
interesting,
the
and
intent.
we could do that, it'd be harder to do that across all the channels, because the cable has much lower viewership than some of the other time slots. So our time slots are different in terms of the ratings, but within certain time slots, we certainly could look at that, and that would be really interesting. Yeah, does sassiness drive viewership? Yeah, yeah.
Or possibly not.
Yeah,
Maybe-
right,
maybe the
right.
opposite, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, related to that, and just a little bit of a question about time, one thing that seems to me possible, there's a certain way in which television programs imitate each other. And there are periods in which certain kinds of things, because they succeed and they get imitated. So if you could, it's probably more, to sort of trace these out over time,
Yeah.
you might find a combination of popularity, so that if something is popular, then 2 years later, you get an awful lot of it, and then eventually, something else will come along. My guess is that's probably what's happening. That, program after program does the same thing. Something written by the same people.
Yeah.
And it's we want some of that flavor to that success.
Yeah. Good. That sounds like a really good dissertation.
In terms of the context, you end up with the question of healthy and pro-social, which is really a normative
It
type
is,
of issue.
absolutely.
But I wonder if in the context of the programs, you're able to detect whether or not the norms of interaction are approving or disapproving of that kind of behavior. And if that isn't kind of escalating it up to a group level kind of a context.
Yeah. I think that the two ways that I could do that is through the humor, okay, which, it's 1 out of 4. So it's not that humor is always there. The other way to do it is to look at whether it's punished or not in the context. So are other characters saying that's mean, or don't talk like that, or you shouldn't really say that, and we don't find that at all, really. So in my mind, as I look at this in terms of our textual variables, the writers, whoever's creating this, it's done with an approval kind of basis. The one thing I didn't present is pain and harm here. We haven't finished coding enough of that for me to present it, but it's, we see, occasionally you see a character feel bad and look hurt by these, but rarely. Again, it's the same thing with the violence, but I think that's another way to look at it. Are you seeing that this could actually hurt someone's feelings? And we don't see that very much, so it's another way of contextualizing it.
I was really curious about the difference between the content watched on computer versus watched on TV and the different result. How do you explain that? Do you know why they would have a different reaction on something that they could? I'm working on preschool now, and our audience is streaming their stuff on their computers as much as they're watching it on their TVs.
Yeah. Well, the only thing we didn't find for computer use is that it didn't predict wishful identification. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
And all I can imagine is that for this young age group, some kids are spending, it's probably a lot more variance in this age group with the amount of time they're spending on the computer, 3 to 5-year-olds, remember,
exactly.
than older kids. My guess is that probably you wouldn't see that distinction if you looked at older kids, but, it's a guess. And really the only difference is that it doesn't predict wishful identification. For the favorite character. But it is true that what a lot of kids are doing on the computers is playing, the games with their favorite character, going to the websites, because you can become fans of all these characters, you can sign up for their fan club and that kind of thing, so, yeah.
How did you account for a difference in length of the TV programs?
Well, the rate is rate per hour, so it's across the whole sample. So, we did count how long it was, and that factored into how many total hours of programs we have, and then what the rate is. Most of the shows in our sample are half an hour, especially the kid-targeted ones. It's only the reality shows that go to an hour, but in general, the rates are across all the programs just by hour. So, yeah.
Tom, you had a question? Did you have any more?
No, Tom, good night.
Oh.
Yeah, in regard to context and pro-social, I wonder if offense or defense would play a different role, because I could imagine rethinking of this is pro-social if it teaches kids to negotiate a tough environment, a tough communicative environment. So whether someone's using it just aggressively, purposely versus as self-defense and responded might make a difference on how you read SAS respect.
We looked at how often these are retaliatory, like going back at, and it's a smaller percentage than what you would think. It was only like 7% of these. So what you see more often is a victim. You know, the nerdy character that everybody's doing this toward, or the kid who's not quite in the circle and he or she is getting pummeled with this kind of thing. So that doesn't quite support the argument that you're raising.
What supports ideas of bullying?
Yeah, and you know, here's hindsight is 20/20. I wish we would have gone back and actually tried to code bully. You know, like who's a bully in this show? I don't know that we could have gotten reliability on that, but I suspect we might have been able to. And we could probably still go back. I don't know if it's worth it to do it on this in this study, but it would be interesting to see if there are identified bullies in the shows and if they're responsible for a lot of this versus the sort of victim, you know. But if you look at the literature on bullying, as it turns out on children, not on TV characters, the literature suggests that the very kids who are bullies are also often the victims of bullying. So it's a real circular kind of thing. It's not like you have one group that's the bullies and one group that's the victims. So
Let's give the last question to Andrea.
Okay, thanks. This is kind of a unusual question. So you started in the beginning of the talk by giving examples of parents' complaints on websites, and I was wondering, has parents' complaints about disrespect and sassiness changed a lot over time? Are there data that suggests that there are more complaints now than there were, you know,
I could
30
only,
or 40
yeah,
years
that's
ago?
a really good question. I don't know the answer, and I'm not sure how I would find the answer to that, but I can tell you from my personal experience, I give a lot of parent talks, and I have since I started in this field, which was back in the late 80s, mid-80s. And I can tell you that in my experiences with large samples of parents or large audiences of parents, I didn't hear anything about this when I first started studying media effects, and I hear about it all the time now. So again, it's anecdotal and it's just my observations, but it's one of the reasons that propelled me to look at this, because I can't tell you how many parents say, you know, in the Q&A, I'll get up to talk about media violence for an hour, and then, you know, the first question, yeah, okay, but what about how rude characters are? There's so much sassy talk, you know, they go right to that. So my experience as a media researcher is that parents are more concerned. But
I would say on the same lines and going back to the 70s, on this, that what you heard about, you know, if you go back earlier, was always violence, and imitated violence was the dominant concern that parents would express. This I don't remember hearing, you know, 30 years ago, 20 years ago. I mean, it's not that people might not have been concerned, but the one that was at the top was that. And sometimes you would hear, I would hear a lot about concerns about commercialism.
There weren't so many programs then, you know. I mean, now,
Those are things you have here would be, you know, it teaches children to want things we don't want them to want, to be a total pain in the supermarket, you know, that kind of thing, and violence. So, I mean, this is relatively new from my experience.
Next week is President's Day, so we won't be having a seminar as usual. Also, the week after that, we're holding open for a job candidate, so I can't announce who will be speaking on that day. However, on Monday, March 1st, if you're thinking ahead in your calendar, we will have Dan Schiller, also from the University of Illinois, who will be here. And the title of his talk is A History of U.S. Public Service Telecommunications, 1918 to 1966. I wanted to mention that at 3 o'clock today in room 207, Barb will be here and available to meet with students or anybody else who would like the opportunity to explore some of these issues.
Come talk sassy.
So, thank you very much, Barb.